So we're here to talk about, are you ready for government inspectors? I'm David Gardner. We'll do a little more uh, introductions in a bit and introducing myself and a few of the other people that you may get involved with or have been involved with working with Pinchin. I'm just trying to get my presentation to work, which is, there we go. So you may be surprised by seeing this. Hopefully this isn't a picture of your the back 40 in your facility, but I've seen many pictures like this. As when I was a Ministry of Labor inspector for about 10 years, and one of the things I did when I was doing my master's of engineering for occupational hygiene is I looked at hazardous waste sites, and this is I'm sure not exactly the same, but looked fairly familiar with some of the stuff that I saw out there. So the objectives of the seminar really is to help you prepare for a government inspector visit, and more ideally is creating a system whereby they really don't need to visit you. The Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Environment, and all the longer names they call themselves these days, have a lot more focused visits than they used to, and you don't have in my day, there was, I got a big stack of paper every month that said all the places I had to visit as a part of a regular inspection. I think some of those days have disappeared, but they may still come around for that. And so what we want to do is keep you out of being in this gentleman's position where he's sitting in court and looking a little apprehensive, keep you out of that nice little accommodation, and make you feel a little more like this at the end of the day, that yes, we made it through another day without interference from the government coming in to do inspections at our workplace. So introduction. So as I said, I'm David Gardner. I'm the National Occupational Health and Safety Practice Leader. As I said, I worked for the Ministry of Labor for about 10 years, and then I worked in the rail business for another 10 or 11 years. And for the last 14 years, I've worked for Pinchin Limited as a consultant. And I know there's a lot of people online. I'm guessing I may have worked with or with some of the companies of the people who are attending. And I really appreciate the number of people that actually sign up for this seminar. That's a little bit heartening that we have this kind of interest. I also want to introduce, and I'll let them introduce themselves, is Brian Agnew out of our Southwestern Ontario Waterloo office. He'll just give you a little bit of background about himself, as he's one of the contacts. If you're looking to use our services, certainly in that region, which spans almost from Barrie right to Windsor. So just a little few minutes about yourself, Brian. Or not. Maybe there's some issues with them doing that. Anyways, just in case, because there may be, I don't have full control. We have our people in Mississauga taking care of this. Maybe everyone's been put on mute just because of the way the presentation works. So Brian is actually the manager for Occupational Health and Safety Services, as I said, from Barrie pretty much to Windsor, and he would be your contact information, your contact for that area. Ryan Mallard on the other side is in the greater Toronto area. So obviously Toronto, Mississauga, Scarborough, Oakville, right over to Oshawa and beyond would be the areas that he's responsible for, and he'd be your contact there. Oh, enough of those things. We're going to talk a little bit about why we are here, or why I think that you're here to hear this. Talk to you a bit of case studies, things from my experience that I've dealt with, not all directly, but close to directly in some cases. We're going to look at the acts, regulation, codes, and guidelines. There's a lot of these, and I just want to get you to appreciate all the things that are out there that you need to be aware of. And of course, some lessons learned. And then we're going to talk about what happens when the inspectors actually visit your site. So we'll give you a little more hands-on if you haven't have the privilege yet, or have had some good or bad experiences. I'm sure either could have happened, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of that visit. And then, of course, somewhat of the price of admission is you have to listen to all the services that Pinchin has. And since I've been with Pinchin from the beginning, I'm often surprised when clients say things like, "Well, I didn't know Pinchin did that." I think you'll find that when it comes to environmental health and safety, there's not much that Pinchin doesn't do. So, having said that, and then we'll finish up with some closing thoughts to get you thinking about um, what you learned here and what steps you might want to take into the future. So the real reason, I don't know exactly why you're here, but I can tell you a lot of our clients, many of you are on this call for sure, have a lot of different reasons for why they're interested in knowing how to deal with inspectors. And really what I'm trying to convince you of is you need to have a good due diligence position in your workplace, and it'll save you a lot of agony in the long run. And I'll tell you about some of my experiences with that. But certainly, we've been hired by a number of companies to do audits, for instance. And one of the reasons they're looking to do that is because they just believe that protecting the environment and people's health and safety is a fundamental responsibility of senior managers and all managers and everyone in the workplace. So there's that ethical part. And then there's reputation. I know specifically a client who actually utilized for some of their facilities because they were a company that invested in buying real estate. And they wanted to make sure that, one, their name never got into the news as, being the building where there's been environmental problems or, things where somebody's been severely hurt. So, their reputational risk is often a very big one. And we find that with a lot of our clients is their reputation, just like Pinchin's reputation, is very important to yours and our business. And there may be personal reasons that you're interested in this particular thing. If you're the frontline health and safety or environmental health and safety manager, then you're going to have to deal with the ministry coming by. And, you may get surprised with things. I remember going into this large hospital when I was doing inspections with the ministry, went and met with the manager for health and safety at the time. And he asked me a simple question, how long do you think this is going to take? Because, I could tell by the question that he was busy. And when I told him that, because back then, when I did an inspection with the Ministry of Labor, and this has changed, we had to do wall-to-wall inspections. And so that meant I was going to be there for a week. And after he picked himself up off the floor, we proceeded to get on with it. And it pretty much took a week to walk through that facility. It was that big. But so you may have some personal issues there. And of course, business is fundamental. I can tell you from my years of experience, I've been doing health and safety and environmental stuff for about 34 years, is that the little dollar sign is very important. Good businesses, from my experience, have good health and safety environmental management systems in place. That's the reason why they're successful. And if you don't have that, then there's always going to be issues with trying to figure out, how we're going to, what's this going to cost us? And the ministry is going to come in and they're going to find all kinds of things. And I know of businesses that were shut down once the ministry and the Ministry of Environment showed up and found out what they're doing. And that was the end of that business because there were that many violations. So money is really important. And it really is understanding that all this health and safety, environmental protection stuff really is just part of good practice and good business. It is managing your business risks, and this is just one of them. So there's some fundamental compliance principles of, perhaps what you're trying to get from this seminar. I don't know, but we'll see as we go through whether I address all those things. But ideally, we have this internal responsibility system. They're often called the IRS, not like the Internal Revenue people in the US, but the internal responsibility system, what this really fundamentally involves is philosophy put forward fundamentally by the government and others, is that everyone in the workplace, including the chief executive officer, all the managers, all the supervisors, all the workers, and all the people that work in there, including contractors and service providers, are all part of making sure that the system works and people are safe on the health and safety side. The alternative to this is having inspectors and having, like, I don't know what there's something like 400 health and safety inspectors, I think, in the province right now, or something like that. And if you didn't have the internal responsibility system, and rather you relied on the government to make sure you're in compliance, now you're talking about tens of thousands of inspectors. So this is the alternative. Business takes care of itself, and the government will try and stay out of the way, believe that or not, or don't take care of things, and things happen. And this is, as we'll see with all the different regulations in place, when governments identify issues that come up, their usual answer is laws. And as we end up with acts and more regulations. The more business takes care of itself, the less regulations there are. And I know there's incidents, the entertainment business to this day doesn't have a health and safety regulation in Ontario. Some of them apply, but there's no fundamental one that applies to them, because they came up with a bunch of internal procedures and stuff that they police themselves. And the ministry has really sat back and let them continue as down the road they're on, because there haven't been continued issues, even though, I can remember when I worked for the ministry, Chris Christopherson at a set in Toronto broke both his legs, and that was a critical injury we had to investigate. But basically that industry has kind of been taking care of itself, or certainly laying low. And so the government hasn't been in dealing with those issues. But that is the basis for the internal responsibility system. You're responsible, and if you do things that are wrong, you're going to be held accountable. Compliance with environmental issues is really the same principle. Everyone's responsible for taking care of the environment. So there's really no surprise there. And, making sure that, little pieces of equipment like this are properly guarded. There's a good chance, in my experience, if I look around the other side of that picture, I'll see an open V-belt. That means it's unguarded, or maybe completely enclosed in that guard, which is the good thing. Or we have lots of stacks and stuff, and people, they got things going on in their workplace and they want to get it out of there. And then they put a fan in a wall, or they put up a stack and they start exhausting stuff to the other doors. Now you're into the environmental regulations. And so this is not uncommon for us to see people doing things, going and do audits and assessments and tell them, by the way, you need a certificate of approval or environmental compliance approval, or what they call EASERs, to do all these things. So just a little of a case study. So one of the things you need to do is try and keep regulators out of your workplace. I know some companies have good relationships with their inspectorate, both environmental, health and safety, and sometimes they may call them to get advice and those kind of things. My experience, having been a regulator, is that is a dicey road, because when they come in, they have to do their job. And if they see things, they have to do something about it. So even though they may be coming in and doing a little bit of a favor for you, they still have to do their job. And so one of the tricks to keeping them out of your workplace is really just complying with the laws, not having complaints, not having work refusals, not having accidents. And so you need to understand those things. And so this case here was a company who was transporting exactly what you see in that picture, the ends of fish that are going for rendering. And as the truck carrying this material turned a corner, about 800 kilograms of the fish ended up on the side of the road. So what the company did is they cleaned it all up. And it turns out they did a pretty good job of that. But what they didn't do is they didn't report that as an environmental spill. Unfortunately for the company, somebody was driving by and stopped, or whatever they did, with their cell phone, and contacted the Spills Action Center, who now contacted the manager of the company, got all the details, and though no other charges were laid for, contaminating environment or extra charges for going in and cleaning up the mess, they were essentially fined a large amount of money, I think around $20,000, for failing to notify the ministry of the spill. I can tell you my experience in my previous employer, we had a spill of about 1,800 liters of sulfuric acid. And when that happened, I called the Spills Action Center. I explained what happened. I told them what we did to remediate the issue, and we never saw the ministry. So when it comes to this kind of thing, I mean, my recommendation, to potentially keep people out of your workplace is if you think if there's a spill and you're not sure whether it's reportable, you need to call the Spills Action Center, and they'll help move you down the line, because things like work refusals, critical injuries, and spills for the Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks, as they're called, is they have no sense of humor when it comes to not reporting these things. So you really need to be, not second guessing yourself on those things. On the health and safety side, what you have to remember is you're thinking about your due diligence systems. People do things, and my experience is it is usually the good workers who somehow get themselves hurt. They're going the extra mile, making sure they're keeping busy, trying taking care of things. I did a fatality at a company here in Brantford where I actually live, and they were making heat exchangers, and they used to put these things in Harrisite, and there would be drips, and they wanted to make sure it looked nice for their clients, so they always took a brush to make sure that all these drips were taken care of, and they had a nice coating on there. And they actually provided this nice long handle brush to the worker. He chose not to use it, and he put himself under a suspended load essentially, and it fell on him, and unfortunately he died. The workplace was, this was a very 9 to 10 people workplace. The CEO of the company was devastated, but nonetheless, this happened. Lift truck fatalities, seen a few of those, and not just fatalities, but two of them. One was a very unfortunate one where it was the uncle's nephew who died because they chose not to manage and maintain their lift trucks. And the brakes didn't work very well. Unfortunately, when the kid got off, because he was a kid, he was I think 19 or 20 years old, got off the lift truck. He left the forks raised. He walked in front to the load that he was going to lift up, and the lift truck rolled forward, and unfortunately got hit by the forks, and something very bad happened. And then there's another one where somebody drove backwards for over 200 meters, and this person was actually trained on the Friday before, his refresher training on how to drive a lift truck, and he was clearly instructed on when he shouldn't be backing up. And he chose not to on this particular day. He didn't have anything on his fork, so there's no reason to back up. And unfortunately, he bumped into somebody, and they died. So what I'm trying to get you to understand here is it's really about due diligence. Things do happen. Do you have systems in place to make sure that you pass the due diligence test, and hopefully never have to pass the due diligence test, because no one will get hurt. There will be no environmental spills, those kind of things. So really, the crux of this whole seminar is put a good system in place, and you won't really need to worry about inspectors coming to your workplace, because you'll have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. So where does it say that? This is a very important statement, and we'll talk about this a little later when we talk about the visits, but the ministry, either ministry cannot come in and essentially do what they want. They can only enforce what's in the legislation. And I can tell you from my experience working with the ministry is hygienists and inspectors who knew they couldn't do things, but were compelled because of their ethics to do something about it. That's really not their job. But the whole gist of this slide is, if an inspector comes in and says they want you to do something, and you're wondering, that doesn't really make sense to me. you need to ask a simple question. Where does it say that? And they should be able to show you the section in the regulations or the act that says that you can't do that. And it's very important in a lot of cases that you take that on. It is not, and I'll talk about this again when we talk about the visit, but it is not your role to come in and worry. I've heard people say things, well, I didn't want to upset the inspector because if I do that, then they're going to start issuing more orders and, really looking hard. And that's in my experience really isn't the case. And you need to defend your workplace and make sure that you're only being asked to do things that are required by the legislation and that these things are actually reasonable things for you to do. So it's a very important question. Where does it say that? And unfortunately, you look at these slides I'm about to present you, and I'm going to talk about one or two of the regulations in each one of them at all. But the whole purpose of the next bunch of slides is to show you how many regulations there actually are and things that you need to be aware of. And, one of the things we will talk about when we talk about programs is ISO standards, ISO 45001, ISO 14001. A lot of people stay away from it. They don't understand it. And all I can tell you is whether you want to implement an ISO standard in your workplace or not is irrelevant to the fact that you should look at what the requirements are in those standards and see what kind of things may be applicable to your workplace. And one of the fundamental things is, how do you know that you need to comply? And one of the fundamental requirements in the ISO standards is to develop a compliance obligations registry. What things do I need to comply with? I need to look at all the different laws out there and determine what applies to my workplace. How else could you possibly know what you're required to do? So in this case, I just want to highlight a couple of things. One is this Occupational Health and Safety Awareness and Training Regulation, which really talks about the working at heights training, but it also has this basic training for staff, and I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about because I'm pretty likely you've had this training. But the regulation you can see was drafted in 2013. You can't forget about the fact that this regulation exists and that new people, new supervisors need to be trained to the requirements of this regulation. And so, just keep that in your forefront because, again, I'll stress it later. When the ministry comes in to doing an investigation or to do an inspection, they always ask for training records. And this is one of the simple ones they're going to ask for. So, just make sure you're in compliance with it. And the last one is WMIS. WMIS is something that, it's every year. Some companies require people to go through the basics of WMIS. WMIS is really fundamentally based on teaching people how to safely handle, use, and store and clean up spills of chemicals that they use. And the other requirement is there actually is no requirement for annual training. Whether you believe me or not, there isn't. But there is a requirement that every year, in consultation with your committee, you have to review the WMIS program to see whether it's adequate. And at that point, there may be recommendations that we need to do additional training because findings we're having. But this is just understanding the regulations as they exist and what they actually mean. I found in my experience very difficult to get people to read legislation. So now you've heard me say some things, and now you may go back and say, well, we don't have to do WMIS training every year. Dave Gardner said we don't have to do that, but we have to do this review at the committee and all this other stuff. And what I would like you to do is actually go to that regulation and read the requirement and understand it for yourself and understand that the annual review part is actually in the act and not in the regulation. Sorry to make it complicated, but that's not what I did. Oh, a bunch more window cleaning. I often get asked this question internally and externally. If I'm on a ladder, I'm over 10 feet in the air or 3 meters in the air, am I required to wear fall protection? Well, if you read the window cleaning regulation, which really applies to window cleaners, as you may imagine, it says right in there that every person except person working on a ladder that works over 3 meters shall have a fall protection system. This regulation actually says that. So if you're looking for guidance, you don't have to look any further than a regulation. So why would this regulation only apply to window cleaning and not to everywhere else? And the real issue for me there is just hooking up to something is probably more dangerous than hooking up to a proper anchor or just using a ladder properly. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and a lot of companies have policies about working on ladders, which is great. We've seen some really good practices there because we don't want to hurt people. But again, these regulations have things in it that may surprise you. Control of exposure to biological chemical agents. There's been some recent changes to this. In Ontario, there is very few specific requirements to have written procedures. Now, if you require your workers to wear respiratory protection, this regulation now says, probably for the last year or so, I can't remember when it was put into force, that you have to have a respiratory control, a written respirator control program in place. Yeah, it hasn't ended yet. Environmental compliances, approvals. This is something we see quite a bit. If you are treating any of your waste on site before it goes into sewers and that kind of thing, you may require an environmental compliance approval. So these are things, and the term sewage use works is very wide and encompassing, and it includes getting rid of rainwater. Stormwater, as it's called in the regulation, and it's so that should be maybe get you to sit up and pay attention for a little bit. So more of them. So where did the ECA's environmental compliance approvals going in Ontario, because they took so long for these things to happen? Now they have these easers in place, environmental activities sector registry, and it just makes it easier for you to actually get what is fundamentally an ECA. There's the requirements to have maintenance procedures and noise assessments and all these things still exist, but now you can go online and you're almost instantly registered. I can tell you one of my past employers was fined $50,000 for putting in a new flare stack, which was more environmentally friendly than the previous one. We waited 2 years for the ECA to come through, and it was actually after 2 years that it came in, and the ministry still charged the company, and they paid a $50,000 fine for running a stack that didn't have an ECA. So this is serious stuff. If you're required to have an easer, then you need to figure out, and you can see some of the other regulations that aren't highlighted here, some of the specific easer requirements. So here's our ECA stuff. So there's a whole guideline on applying for these things, and easers aren't necessarily that much easier to apply for, and you may need some help from our environmental reduction group, our ERC group, but you may also require an ECA. And so these are the same changes. If you have an ECA for something that should be under the easers, then depending on when your ECA runs out, you will have to apply for an easer, or you may, I believe, at any point apply for an easer to get out of those requirements. Yes, there are a lot of environmental regulations. So here's all your air pollution, local air quality standards in that regulation. A couple of things that are happening. Doug Ford's been preoccupied with something called COVID, I think. But he at one point said he was going to get rid of these waste audit regulations. So these are two of them. So these are the ones that require you to do waste audits every year, depending on how big your company is, and go around and doing things like what they call dumpster dives, where you take all your garbage for a day, dump it on the floor, and somebody counts and weighs it, puts it in the bag, and tells you how well you're recycling. Those regulations are supposed to disappear. I don't know when that's going to happen now, but it certainly was on the agenda at the beginning of Doug Ford's term. Getting tired of seeing regulations yet? PCB regulation. There's a lot of issues that go on. What you have to recognize is the federal government is the one who actually regulates the storage, handling, and use of PCBs. And but what every province has is a regulation that deals with when you're getting rid of PCBs and you're transporting it to a waste site, how you do that. And I can tell you that there's, a lot of people will think, well, we tested our transformer, it's less than 50 parts per million PCB, so we're good to go. And then they have a spill. And then somebody may come in and they may find out that under the federal regs, the reporting requirements can be as low as 2 ppm. So they're completely two different sets of regulations. One's telling you when you can get rid of waste as being not containing PCBs, and the other one is how you manage it. And they're not completely different, but they're fundamentally different. And you just need to understand that this one regulation in Ontario does not address all the fundamental requirements for all the handling and storage of PCBs. Environmental penalties. So here's, if you think that you've looked at the Environmental Protection Act and now you know everything you need to know about environmental compliance, well, we have this Water Resources Act. And one of the things to notice here is that environmental penalties regulation is the same regulation that's cited under the Environmental Protection Act. The other one is something that we see quite commonly being issues with, and this is if at some point the property you have, they put in monitoring wells to monitor things that are moving through the groundwater on or off your site. And so they may put them in just for a year or so to see what's going on, but the wells regulation requires you to maintain those things, because you understand what you now have is if the cap on that well is opened, which looks like this very often, then there's direct access to the groundwater. And so this is a significant route of environmental contamination that you need to take care of. And this regulation requires you to manage and make sure you're maintaining these monitoring wells, which more contemporarily look like this. So they're a little more obvious, but if you walk around your site and you see something that has that nice little triangle on it or says monitoring well, or it looks like this nice little blue thing sticking out of the ground, you have to make sure you're either managing that well or decommission it officially, so you no longer have access to the groundwater. So you should be feeling like this. That's what I feel when I'm trying to do audits and trying to make sure I cover everything off when I'm in the workplace. Sometimes this is the way I feel because I have to make sure that I'm in there and I'm identifying all the non-compliances that there may be at the facility. And I can tell you our experience with doing compliance audits when we're doing environmental health and safety generally, and we usually only do audits for very sophisticated companies that have great systems in place. I can tell you that right from the beginning. We'll have anywhere from 30 to 60 findings under all those different regulations. Because we have the federal regulations, and SEPA is very poorly understood. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and then here's his regulations, PCBs, ozones, and MPRI is one. I don't know if you're familiar with this terminology, National Pollutant Release Inventory, but every January the federal government posts a notice, and it says essentially that every person has to look at that notice and determine whether they need to report. And just because you didn't report last year doesn't mean that this year you might have to report. So this is something you should be looking at every year in your workplace. If it's an office building, it may be questionable, but you may also have things like sulfur dioxides and other greenhouse gases and stuff being released that you may be required to report under greenhouse gases, or you may actually be required to report under MPRI. And recognizing MPRI, it actually doesn't even matter if you release anything to the environment, you just have to bring it into your workplace. So I used to work in the rail business where we used to manufacture rail cars, and literally, I'm using that term properly, we bring in tons and tons and tons and tons of steel. And so there's a few contaminants that are identified in MPRI where just because that stuff comes into the workplace, we still had to report, even though there was very few releases to atmosphere. we had some welding and stuff that had some releases, but just the volume of the material we brought in would require us to report to NPRI. So this is something that you should not ignore, regardless of the workplace that you're in. Air conditioning, we see lots of violations and compliance issues with ozone depleting substances, because that's an ever-changing thing, and a lot of the bans on some of these ODSs are now reaching, I think, 2025 or something. There's going to be the end of it. So you've got people coming in, managing your air conditioners. You need to make sure you have systems in place. And then we have a bunch of other things. We have building codes. The building code tells you how to build things, and then you have the provincial fire code that tells you how to maintain your fire system. There's also a requirement in the building code that if you're managing, that you have to manage all hazardous materials in your building according to the requirements of the fire code. And if the fire code doesn't apply, which is the case of things essentially in Ontario, if it's not a flammable or combustible liquid, or potentially some compressed flammable gases, the fire code doesn't apply. And now you have to comply with the national fire code, which addresses all dangerous goods. So don't think, I'm in Ontario, I just have to comply with the Ontario Fire Code. You may have to comply with the requirements of the National Fire Code as well. And then there's all these other standards and things that come in there. And then the last one that you need to be aware of is the lawyers that we work with are telling us what goes on in the courts, and some employers are being found guilty of not complying with their own internal procedures. And yeah. And so what this really means, though, is the courts have now looked at it and said, Mr., Mrs., and Ms. employer, I don't know the proper term there to preface employer, but the employer is compelled to put in reasonable systems to protect the workers and protect the environment. And so what the expectation is, why would you do something that wasn't required to address a hazard or environmental aspect in your workplace? So what they're saying is that if the employer decides that, yes, this is something we need to do and puts it into a written procedure, and they don't follow their internal procedures, there must be something going on. Like why would a reasonable person put things in place that weren't there to protect people or protect the environment? So this is what you need to think about, is your internal procedures need to reflect not only reality, they need to reflect what you actually are committed to doing. So don't put something in writing if you're not going to actually do it. I mean, it's not the end of the world if, there's minor violations of it, or, through your tracking system, you find some people aren't following your procedures, because that's very important. As I'll give you an example in a minute, but, really make sure your procedures reflect the reality of your workplace. So one of my previous employers, we had a couple of people fall very long distances, and both of them survived. I think some days they wish they didn't survive, because they really damaged their bodies significantly. But in both those cases, near fatalities, and there was actually later on, after I left their employment, there was actually a confined space fatality. And in all those cases, those two critical injuries, very serious critical injuries, and that fatality, that employer was not charged. And the reason why is because they had systems in place, and I helped them write those systems. And after I left, they continued managing those systems. That they did everything reasonable that a reasonable person would do to protect the workers, and yet they chose to do things that they shouldn't have done. I can tell you, in the case there, the one worker who fell off the equipment that they were on was actually told 3 times by their own co-worker to put their fall protection on. We did training every year on fall protection. Every 6 months, we did a safety meeting that discussed when and where you're required to wear fall protection, how to wear it, all those things. And that was all documented. People signed off on it. And of course, we had these nice procedures in place. And with the confined space, they went back and looked at all the records, and this worker did everything they're supposed to do for every entry they ever did. at that employer, except for the one Friday when they were in a hurry and went into this confined space and inhaled some sulfuric acid mist and a bunch of other gases that were in the confined space, and succumbed to his injuries 2 or 3 days later. All the systems are in place. And the ministry just looked at it and said, what else could you have done? There's nothing else we think this employer could have done. And they were not charged. And these are very serious injuries. So take some stake, not only in making sure you comply with your own procedures, but make sure they make sense. And if you don't have some of these procedures, then you need to be thinking about having them and having systems in place to make sure that things are done. Like what I did mention, we also went out and we disciplined everyone who didn't wear their fall protection as we're trying to implement that thing. And we disciplined workers, supervisors, and we even disciplined people from head office that came out and did some silly things in the workplace where they should have worn fall protection and didn't. And all those things put together, the ministry really didn't have any choice. They didn't think they could win a case in court. The last big one is the criminal code. The criminal code changed quite a while ago to make sure that if you're not taking reasonable steps, or if you're showing a reckless disregard for the lives of others, then you're going to be held accountable. And this is obviously for very serious things. That there's going to be trouble, not just if there's a fatality and the coroner's constable shows up, which they always do. That's not necessarily trouble. But if the police continue to do investigations, then you may start to worry about criminal code charges, because only the police can lay charges on the criminal code. The Ministry of Labor cannot do that. And the Ministry of Labor Skills Development, Trades and Skill Development, as they're called now. I'll just call them the Ministry of Labor. And one of the key cases for this was Metron, and this happened quite a while ago, just before Christmas. 4 or 5 people died on a swing stage, and in this case, at the final end of it, a bunch of things came up, and one was companies can be certainly held accountable for the actions of their supervisors, and not just senior executive, because the person who was charged, the company was certainly charged, but there was the supervisor in charge of that swing stage who allowed all those workers to climb onto the swing stage, to go down to the ground at the end of their shift just before Christmas, instead of taking the stairs or the elevator, was held accountable. And the key thing here is you can see the criminal conviction is perhaps most likely where the company, through a supervisor, is aware of a hazard and doesn't do anything about it. In the case of this, the owner of the company didn't know the supervisor was making this decision, but they were still held accountable. So this is not just targeting chief executive officers, it's charging anyone in the workplace who has control of the workplace. And this could be a contractor. So recognize that. And one of the other key things, just to where, as our the culture in Canada, is ever changing. One of the biggest things, well, not one of the biggest, one of the key things that the courts were concerned about was that these workers were poorly trained. And one of the issues was English was not their mother tongue. And so there was real questions about how well these workers are trained on what they were allowed and not allowed to do. And it was obviously a big part of the case that these workers, I think they barely spoke English at all. So worth it to be. So 25(2)J of the Occupational Health Safety Act says you shall prepare and review at least annually a written occupational health safety policy. It's a nice document you put up on the wall, and develop and maintain a program to implement that policy. So this means a lot of different things. It's really up to the Ministry of Labor of how they enforce it and what written procedures they expect to see. As I said, there's a few written procedures required in the regulations, like lockout tagout and respiratory protection, a few other things. But it's not expressly said that you need to have written programs. But I can tell you, every time the ministry updates their regulations, you're seeing the word written being put in there. So the key to this, to your due diligence, is write a meaningful policy statement. And this doesn't mean going to the internet and saying, well, that one looks good and let's use that one. This is getting buy-in from your chief executive officer as to what it says and that your policy reflects the values of the organization. Ensure that you have the resources available to actually make this whole thing come true. Because if you don't, you're going to fall short, and the ministry is going to come in, look at your procedures, look at what's going on, and say, you know, it looks like you're going to do all these wonderful things, and you haven't been doing them, and now somebody's been hurt. Make sure you have a system to develop, implement, and monitor your appropriate standard procedures and practices. So this is all part of your inspection program and making sure, how do you know you're complying with it? And job descriptions. This has come up a number of times in prosecutions. You need to have accountability, and your procedures should actually be saying, and this is something I find quite often, people will write procedures and it doesn't say anywhere in there who's required to comply, who's required to do those individual mandatory steps. You need to identify who's responsible for it and who's going to be held accountable, and you need to hold people accountable when they make mistakes. So if you're going to say we did everything reasonable, but this one supervisor let it slip, and you can't show anywhere that supervisor was somehow disciplined or held accountable, then it's going to go right up to the employer. So if you want to avoid that standard, we don't charge workers unless we charge supervisors, we don't charge supervisors unless we charge the employer, philosophy of the Ministry of Labor, then you need to be able to show that the people who were held accountable and who were responsible were held accountable. Sorry, just that word again. So, but anyways, and a lot of this is, again, you go back to the ISO standards and you will see all these things in there. The biggest change to the ISO standards in 2015 was improvements on the requirement to have commitment by upper management. So I think this is a good point. We can take like a 5-minute break. So I have 11:51, or maybe I can give you 9 minutes, 8 minutes. Now it's 11:52. So if we can come back in exactly 8 minutes, and we will get going again and talk about the actual site visit and some of the things to be cognizant of there. I hope everybody's back. So I did forget to mention, and I put it on the chat as well, that if you have questions, Jose Barank is monitoring the Q&A feature that's you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen somewhere. And then as questions come up, I can certainly answer them, or you can put your hand up and hopefully Jose will be able to see that and go through. So proceeding on. This is interesting with virtual things. I can't see how many people have not come back yet, so we just assume we're all here. But so I hope you are and enjoying the seminar so far. So the visit. Well, why does the government do inspections? Well, as I did mention, they do. They will have some annual routine inspection targets. If you go to the Ministry of Labor site, you will see they actually now post their plans. They post their blitz programs and all the other things that are going on out there that can be quite valuable to you if you're worried about them coming in, or you're wondering what kind of things they're focused on. And then it'll be easier for you to try and address things, because as we know, there's a lot of things going on. I was environmental health and safety manager and director for a large company. I know there was always something going on, and trying to make my life simpler by knowing what the ministry would focus on would help me prioritize my plan for the year or the month or the day sometimes. So they may also looking to evaluate compliance based on their annual targets. Again, there may be new legislative changes that come through. One of the changes that we never remarkably, we didn't see a lot of action from the ministry on is when they removed the exemption for construction from the regulation respecting biological and chemical agents. The ministry really did very little on construction sites after that. We were kind of mystified by that, but these are the kind of things that usually spur some business, like when the noise regulation come in 2015. When as I said, the regulation for the control of exposure to biological and chemical agents now requires respiratory protection programs, so you can be sure they'll be looking for that kind of stuff. And then they also focus on certain sectors, and there may also be referrals. And we say, well, what kind of referrals are you talking about? Well, one of those workplaces that got shut down that I mentioned was a little place that used to actually paint hockey masks for the NHL, and we went in on a complaint, or the Ministry of Labor did. It's not a we anymore. Went in on a complaint about somebody. The owner fired somebody. They complained to the Ministry of Labor. The inspector went in, saw what was going on, and called the Ministry of Environment. And I've done the same thing myself when I was a Ministry of Labor inspector, and I saw environmental issues going on, and I would call the local office and alert them to it. So those are the kind of referrals that we're really talking about here. And then there's things that are mandatory, probably based more on policy than regulation or acts. But if there's noise and odor complaints, and you get enough of them, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is going to show up, and they're going to look at this. A lot of people don't understand that, environmental contamination includes noise and includes odors, even if they're pleasant odors. I know I remember complaints for a place that made cinnamon buns, and that may be bringing back memories of cinnamon buns and how good they are. But, if you have to smell that every day, it probably wears away on you. And, those are odors under the Environmental Protection Act and issues that have to be dealt with. Or it could be complaints, like I said, just the complaint I talked about, where the worker complained he wasn't being treated properly. Dangerous things are going on in the workplace, and then the ministry was called. Could have been retribution in that case, but it really didn't matter. There was all kinds of things going on there that employer should not have been doing. Accidents and incidents, we already talked a little bit about spills, critical injuries, work refusals. These are all the big hitters for the ministries. If these things happen, you need to be very, very careful about deciding whether you're going to report them or not. And and I only say that because sometimes there's questions, what is a critical injury? Sometimes, is it a work refusal or is it a worker complaint? And, you really should be having procedures in place of how you deal with the work refusal, because I can tell you the workers do not have to use the word refusal for it to be a work refusal. And, how big of a spill does a spill need to be reportable? Well, we have a regulation that deals with that. It's called fundamentally, it talks about the exemptions from spills reporting. But you need to understand all these things, and it's not always clear whether these things are reportable or not. And, usually the best bet in these type of situations is to contact somebody and ask the question. Call the Spills Action Center, or call the Ministry of Labor office, or your local district Ministry of Environment office if you know people there, and just ask them, this is going on, and what do you think? And, like I said, I certainly don't recommend you inviting them into your workplace, because, again, they have things they have to do. But, you certainly need to, if you can, build up a relationship with them, because one of the fundamental things that they're going to be trying to figure out when they're coming in to do the visit is something called, do you get it? And it was almost laughable for me, and I probably did chuckle a little bit. We had one client who had somebody seriously hurt in this one machine because of guarding, and they had 8 of these machines. And after the worker was hurt, they fixed and guarded the one machine. And then I was there on another issue on Friday, and they said, "Oh yeah, the Ministry of Labor coming on Monday to see what we're going to do." And I looked at them and said, "Well, you only guarded one machine out of 8." And I said to them, I said, the ministry is going to be coming in, and they're going to make a decision whether they're going to prosecute or not, or recommend prosecution is more appropriately, because It's only legal counsel who decides to prosecute. And I told them, I said, they're going to come in and the ministry is going to try and figure out, do you get it? Like, do you understand health and safety? Do you believe in it? Do you have a system in place to try and protect people, a reasonable one, like my previous employer had, all those wonderful procedures and policies and actions in place? Do you have those things? And the inspector came in on the Monday, and I spoke with the client sometime after that, and they said, you know what, the inspector came in and they said, we don't get it. It's just like, I'm sorry to hear that, but you know, being a health and safety professional, I do it because I believe in protecting people, and I could see what was going on in that workplace, and the ministry had to do what they had to do to bring that company in line, unfortunately. And that's what, again, the whole gist of this is trying to bring yourself in the line. I mean, these are not things that you can solve instantaneously. It may take a couple of years, in some cases more than that, to get some of these systems in place, but you got to be working down the road. And if you're working at it and the ministry thinks you get it, then you're far less likely to be charged. And things will go much smoother with that inspector. So, Ontario, the Ministry of Labor in Ontario, their inspectors, as far as I know, I don't think they've changed this, have inspectors that do what we call inspections and investigations. Investigations are where you now have a critical injury and they're investigating to determine whether prosecution is going to happen. For the Ministry of Environment in Ontario and Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, they have, depending on what it is, they have enforcement officers. So here's a clue. When an enforcement officer shows up, and their business card will very often say that, you better pay attention, because that person is there because they're seriously considering prosecution. It's not a slam dunk, but they're there to determine whether they have enough information and evidence to successfully charge you or to successfully find you guilty, because that's obviously what they want to do. So this is a little different for some of these different entities. So Ministry of Labor, and we'll talk about what's going to happen when they change hats. But for the Ministry of Environment and for the Federal Ministry of Environment, very often you'll know that something is up because these enforcement officers are there. So preparing for the visit. So this is your due diligence again. I'm going to probably say it a couple more times, but you need to make sure that you're inspecting, monitoring your workplace, your program, making sure people are doing what you believe they're doing, making sure that people are following your procedures. You know, that one fatality I told you about with the lift truck, when that went to court, what the lift truck driver told the courts was the reason he did that is he knew it was wrong, but his supervisor was continually putting production pressures on him to get things done, and he was in a hurry because of what his supervisor did. So is this a good workplace? That's why we ended up charging them, because we could see that they were not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they didn't get it, at least for this particular situation. So making sure you have systems in place to do all this stuff, making sure your chief executive officer, your president, who's in charge of your company knows what's going on, because they can no longer sit back and say, well, I hired Joe Blow to be our environmental health and safety manager, and I rely on that person to make sure all these things are in place, and that's what I've done. They can no longer do that. They now need to make transparent decisions about, am I going to give that person enough money to do their job, or am I going to hire somebody? We see it a number of times, and it's not necessarily bad, worse, or indifferent, but we see a lot of people that work in the human resources department or people in culture, depending on your organization, and they know they need someone to do health and safety, And so, that's not a bad place to let go. Now we're going to make the HR manager, the health and safety manager, which means a lot of getting up to speed, which is not a problem, but you got to make sure you have somebody that can actually do the job, and you need to know how far you can rely on them. So if that person is new to the job, then obviously there needs to be a lot more involvement of the managers and stuff in the organization. And the only good health and safety systems I've seen are the ones that the system is not put in place because of all the actions of the health and safety manager. It's because all the supervisors, all the managers, the CEOs, the presidents, and the workers put it into place. And that's what, and really, a really good, strong system with a good, strong health and safety manager is probably one where, things are almost running, not lack of a better term, on autopilot, but we know things are running, and the health and safety manager is more of a steward and a guiding hand to make sure when things come up that they get addressed, and make sure that all the systems are working. So that's good. Right back to the IRS. Make sure you know where about your facilities operation. So here's a classic one. We go in and do audits, and we walk through the workplace. We're looking for where chemicals are stored, for instance, and if we don't see secondary containment, or even if we do, then we're going to start wondering about looking around for other things, and we may see a drain in the floor. Where does that drain go? Well, I don't know. Well, you should know. Does that go to sanitary? Does it go to the storm system? Is it treated before it goes off site? There's all these things you should know. And again, this is all part of you getting it. The ministry comes in, and you should know all the things about the environmental impacts on your site. Where do these drains go? And what do they do? Where does that go? Why is that being stored out in the yard without secondary containment? Why are all these things in place? You need to have the answers, because if you don't have the answers, then the ministry is going to realize that you don't get it, because you don't have the answers and you haven't taken care of this stuff. Know where your records are. The thing that happens very often after we do an audit is, after we leave, the workplace is organized, because now they know all the things that the inspectors may look for, and they have all these records at their fingertips. We spend a lot of time in audits waiting for records to as proof of compliance to arrive, because people have to go find things, and sometimes it's very difficult. And again, stressing the importance of those training records. It's like the second or third thing that comes out of the Ministry of Labor inspector's mouth when they're doing an investigation is, I need to see training records, because we need to know that the people in the workplace have been properly told what they're supposed to do. And of course, you should be monitoring whether they're doing that. Make sure all your postings are up to date. So you want to make sure your Form 82, the 4 steps to an injury under WSIB, the prevention poster from the Ministry of Labor, posting of the most current Occupational Health and Safety Act, and all the other postings that the government may require. Having an up-to-date health and safety policy, and making sure that if you sign it and date it, that it is current in the last year. Or if you just post it and don't want to have to keep taking it down, then have a documentation somewhere, like in the Joint Health and Safety Committee minutes, that we reviewed the policy this year. And that, so the one that's on the board is the most current one. Know what consultants are doing. It's very easy to get busy, and we get that because we're consultants. That you're busy doing stuff, and sometimes the only way you can get it done is you need some help. And that's what we're Pinchin is here to do, is to help our clients. But you need to know what we're doing and understanding all the things we do for you. So you don't necessarily have to answer the question. So if somebody says, have you reviewed your requirements for reporting to NPRI this year? Well, yet I know we have a letter here. Pinchin did the review for us and determined that, again, this year we don't need to report. And here's my proof. Beautiful. That's the kind of stuff you need to have in place. But again, don't just hire consultants. And again, you don't need to know everything they have to do. It's like hiring an electrician to do some electrical work. You need to know that they're following proper lockout tagouts. You need to know that they're certified electricians. some fundamental things. You don't need to know, why they're using number 6 wire instead of number 12, but you need to understand some of the fundamental things of what they're doing there and that they're doing them properly. And not just, as we've seen in a lot of cases, statements and contracts to say, the contractor is obliged to comply with all applicable legislation. That's really not cutting it anymore. You need to know that the electrician is locking that panel up before they go and replace the breaker or whatever they're doing. So understand consultants and your contractors are doing. Understand what you're required to do. And again, this is what I mentioned. They used to call this legal and other registry. Now under the more current ISO standards, they're called compliance obligations. This is really just you sitting down, going through all those things that I showed you, and there's probably a few more, and saying, does this one apply to us? Nope, nope. And here's a list of the ones we know do apply to us. And it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. I've seen some very detailed compliance obligation registries that not only say we need to comply with the Occupational Health Safety Act, but here's all the specific sections we need to comply with. It's really, you just need to know what legislation and regulations and guides and other things you need to comply with. And I mention guides because there is a general duty in Ontario and every other province not to pollute. And so what does that mean? So in Ontario, we have this guideline, which tells you how to manage the storage and handling of chemicals. I can't remember the full long name for it, but in there is where you find, things I think you've heard about, the 110% capacity for secondary containment and, having spills procedures. All those things are written into that guide. And if you don't think the ministry believes that the things that are in those guides are important, then just don't have one of them, and then you'll find out. So either you comply with those guides or you have some equivalent compliance with that, because this is what the government see as compliance. And they'll very often mention in there, by the way, this is a voluntary thing, or this is not. But if it doesn't, you need to, understand why you're not doing it and be able to explain perhaps to an inspector why you have a bunch of chemicals and you don't have a written spills procedure, and you don't train people on how to do spills response. You don't have spill kits, or your spill kits are half empty because you're not inspecting and monitoring them. This is, again, this compliance obligation registry will help you with that. And you can also identify other things that you want to comply with. There may be a CSA standard, an ANSI standard, an ISO standard that you want to put in there. Of course, those are all voluntary, but this is the purpose of this compliance obligations registry. So site access, recognize these inspectors have legislative rights of entry, and it does vary from inspector to inspector depending on the legislation. These officers, in a lot of ways, have more rights than a police officer. A police officer cannot just show up at the front door of your workplace and come in. The Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Environment, Environment Canada, Transport Canada, the inspectors that believe that dangerous goods are somewhere on your site, they all have the power of entry. Of course, they try and do that in a reasonable fashion, but depending on you and whether you get it and their experience with you, they may or may not. So the Ministry of Labor fundamentally, their legislation is very general, and they essentially have 24/7 powers to enter your workplace without notice. And I don't know if they still do it, but when I did work for the ministry, I know there's inspectors that went in through back doors because they knew things were being hidden from them, and they're going to find them because, maybe the employer thought they're being tricky, and, I don't have to worry about it. I can remember doing this audit, and it was quite funny because I was walking through the workplace and I could see about 10 meters in front of me, someone else in the workplace going around and telling people to put their safety glasses on and their gloves and other things to do as I was walking to the workplace. It was like, okay, that's everything I saw there, I wrote up. And the ministry doesn't have to. The act says that the inspectors may issue orders in writing if they choose to. It says may, they don't have to. They can ignore things. But if they actually do see something, they are kind of compelled to put it in writing, even though they don't necessarily have to. But so just recognize, if the ministry really gets their token and not, they're just gonna they're gonna walk in and you're gonna have a hard time stopping them. I mean, you can stop them, and their policies should be, if I don't think they've changed, is they will withdraw from the workplace and they'll bring their friendly police officer with them. And if that doesn't work, they'll go to court and they'll get a court order and they'll come in, and it's going to be very messy. Again, this is taken very seriously, and the chances of not being charged if you deny access, unreasonable access for the Ministry of Labor is not going to go very well. The Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks, they can enter your workplace without warrant or notice or a court order, but it says at reasonable times. And generally, as I understand it, that's during business hours. So typically, you're not going to see a Ministry of Environment officer outside of business hours, but they will do what they need to. And all they have to do is see that there's any part of the natural environment, which is just about anything outdoors of your facility, or entering any place that would contain documents that pertain to some of the legislation. So pretty wild and wide and encompassing. Wild is probably what you're thinking, anyways. But
Dave,
so
sorry, we have a question here, and I don't know if you want to answer it now or if you want to look at it afterwards.
No, let's break from me talking continuously.
Sure. Okay, so why don't I just read it off, and then if you want, you can answer it. So the question is there any information or guidance on workplace inspections in regards to the company size? The requirement is to have 100% monthly, but with large size companies, it becomes a challenge. I could not find much guidance on the subject, where to find the square foot size and the frequency of inspections.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to probably give you some bad news. My perspective, and when I worked for the ministry, and recognize that was, I guess, 24 years ago, I worked for the ministry. So the legislation says you shall inspect the entire workplace unless there's reasons why you can't do it. And one of the tricks there was, if you're not going to do it, if you think your workplace is too big, or too complex, then the Joint Health Safety Committee has to develop a inspection plan, essentially. And that's very often what's missing. So, I've been into workplaces and we don't inspect the entire workplace because it's so big. And that's the end of it. So, well, yeah, but you're required to actually have a plan of how you're going to make sure the workplace is done throughout the entire year. So there's a lot of things in the legislation. I know some people I've spoken to say, why don't they just tell us what we need to do? Like, why can't you tell us once it hits 500,000 square feet, whatever that is in square meters, that we're not required to inspect the entire workplace every month? Because, first of all, you really don't want it being that explicit, because you really, whether you believe me or not, you really want to have flexibility in how you administer health and safety and environmental protection in your workplace. And this is why, good employers, is probably most of the ones on the call, have those systems in place and understand what they need to do and put these reasonable things in place. But what I can tell you is, we looked at companies when I worked for the Ministry of Labor, like Ford, GM, Toyota, Chrysler, that have workplaces that, I don't know, are 1 million, 2 million square feet, and they manage to inspect their entire workplace every month. So how are you going to explain why you can't? So that's kind of the trick. But at the very least, it's not the end of the world if the ministry comes in and issues orders and saying, well, I looked at your workplace and I think you should inspect it every month, the entire 100% of it every month. But you want to make sure that that's the only order they issue, and they don't issue the order that, by the way, that not only you're not inspecting the workplace once a month, you don't even have a plan that's agreed to with the Joint Health Safety Committee. Because if you have that agreement of the Joint Health Safety Committee, you're you're already jumped almost all those hurdles before the finish line. Because if the ministry comes in and they're trying to figure out whether they think the workplace is too complicated, but the Joint Health Safety Committee fully agrees with what they're doing, they're more likely to say, okay, yeah, keep doing what you're doing. As long as the committee's happy and the workers are happy or the union's happy, you're good to go. So unfortunately, there is no direct guidance on that, but you better have good reasons for it. And if you do have that plan in place, that if you look through Section 9 of the Act, you will see that requirement in there to have that plan in place. Okay, hopefully that answered the question. Maybe not the way you wanted to hear it, but it's not just size, it's complexity as well. And you could have a small workplace that's very complex that you can't do every month for some reason or another. So during the visit, be prepared and try not to appear frustrated, because if once the ministry thinks you have your backup about this, they may look at things a little differently. You want to be relaxed and okay, the ministry's here, I have to deal with it. Let's just get on with it. I'm going to cooperate and do what we need to do. Be respectful, but expect to be treated that way. And this is what I think I mentioned previously. Don't think you're doing yourself any favor by treating the inspector with kid gloves. Because if you don't think they're right about something, then ask them where it says that. If you ask them to explain why this is an issue, because you don't really understand it. And very often it's a learning opportunity. All I can tell you is when I worked for the ministry, in my early years, I can still remember some of the stupid things I did. And when I went back later and my manager saw what I did, and then there was some training going on. This is the way it's interpreted, and okay, it's all we're good to go. So don't expect that the ministry inspectors know everything about everything, because you saw the number of regulations there are. How could they? Like, it's very difficult when we do audits. I mean, I always go back and sift through the legislation to make sure that if I'm telling you need to do something, that you actually have to. So that respect should go both ways, and just expect them to be reasonable. You can ask them for ID and they have to produce it. This may get their back up, but in this day and age, because one of the things that I'm expecting people to be interested in, and they may or may not be, is what about COVID? And so we have clients and potential clients where we haven't done work for a year and a half, 2 years, because they won't let us come into their workplace. And the Ministry of Labor inspector shows up, and if you think that your COVID rules are going to prevent them from entering your workplace, I think you're going to be sorely mistaken, because they certainly have the right to come in. Obviously, they need to follow the COVID rules and all the other things. You can expect that they have to comply with your safety procedures. If you require an orientation before they go out on the floor, they really should be saying, okay, no problem. Where do I sit and then listen to this? I mean, you need to be careful with it. You don't want ever to make it look like you're somehow delaying them. But if you're doing the same thing that any visitor comes to the workplace, the ministry is supposed to be complying with that, because it's their safety of their inspectors that is important too, right? They shouldn't be going into some of these workplaces without knowing that, by the way, if you hear this horn going, you better stay with me and catch up if you're not, because something serious is happening. Because the Ministry of Labor, the government doesn't want their inspectors to get hurt, and they need to comply with all your safety procedures, whatever PPE requirements there are, and you should expect compliance. I mean, that is the way I was trained, and the way the policies of the ministries that I saw is that's going to happen. But for COVID, you need to be very careful. Like, you can certainly, if they refuse to get their temperature taken, if that's part of your policy, they refuse to fill out a questionnaire because that's part of your policy. My suggestion to you is you say, excuse me, officer, I would like to speak to your manager. Because if you put reasonable safety rules in place, including COVID, they should be following them. And, I think you've seen what's been going on. I know from what I know to date, there's been something like 278 work refusals for COVID, and 277 of them are found not likely to endanger. I don't know the conditions of the one that was, but so, the ministry certainly recognizes that all the things employers are doing is consistent with proper COVID policies. So why wouldn't they follow them? So, but again, this is part of it. So just expect that they're going to comply with your policies, and some mutual respect going on there. Make sure you try, if they ask questions, provide the best answer you can, or know when the workplace can. I mean, that's not uncommon. When we do audits and work in your workplaces, we talk to a number of different people who have the information we're looking for. You just need to look knowledgeable and know where to get the information. And again, training records and all that stuff. So where is all this information? If they come by, and, some workplaces, when we go and do audits, because they've been through audits before, I'll show up, sit down, we do our opening meeting, and then they put a great big binder in front of me with all the stuff that I'm probably going to ask for. And they're usually right. So it's just really about being organized, but, provide the best answer you can. If you don't know the answer, then, explain to them why, and, maybe that other person's not there that day, or you need to look something up. If you're treating them reasonably and with respect, you're going to get the respect back from them. And so, and again, as I said, if it's not clear what they're looking for, then where does it say that? So during the visit, make sure you're trying to take your own notes and photographs and different things, because you don't want to necessarily just rely on everything that they have in their notes. You need to be comparing these things. In court, notes and those kind of things are not admissible evidence anyways, but when I was trained as an inspector, what I was told is you take good notes, you make sure that you don't alter your notes after the fact. And if you're on the stand and you can ask if you can refer to your notes, and that actually adds credibility in the view of the courts, because they know that nobody remembers everything. And it's just, you look at your notes and you remember things, and you may be able to do the same thing, but having those notes and what did the officer see? What did the officer say? What did they look at? And I got pictures of it. I've seen other guidance where they say, if they come in and do air monitoring or noise sampling or testing of sewage water or something, take your own samples as well and get them sampled, tested individually. It's something to think about. It's not always going to be possible, but is a possibility. And understand that investigations are different from routine inspections. So what the ministries have to do is, and I have a couple of legal interpretations on the next slide, but they have to recognize that you have rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this is the one that says that they can't charge you and collect evidence without telling you about your rights, which includes having legal counsel and a bunch of other things. So there's a fundamental principle. What they've determined under law is when inspectors are doing inspections, and this is one of the reasons they have access to your workplace, they have rights to ask questions and get answers from people that even police officers don't have the right to get. And it's because the government believes that health and safety, environmental protection requires this latitude in your rights, that you're compelled to answer these questions. Of course, I have a fundamental belief that under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I don't have to answer questions if the ministry asks me, but potentially I could be charged if I refuse to answer questions. If it's an inspection, if it's an investigation, so the way it works is, once a reasonable person, this is a reasonable person test, once a reasonable person would assume that the inspector should have formulated in their mind that prosecution is possible, they're now into investigation mode. And all that latitude under inspections is gone. And now they have to comply with all the strict requirements of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, and if they choose not to read you your rights, and a reasonable person would have formulated that inspector had enough information to believe they would charge you, some or all of that evidence may or may not be admissible in court, and likely it won't be, because they cannot collect information from you if they know that there's a potential that, not that they're going to charge you, that there is a potential that you're going to be charged. So this is very important. So if you're sitting there and the inspector's asking you questions and you're answering it and you're worried about prosecution, you really shouldn't be until the point where they read you your rights. And then you know that, okay, this is now turned into an investigation. And if you have enforcement officers show up, then to me, clearly you have an investigation going on, and they have to allow you to have legal counsel and all the other things that go along with it. Oh, it's just like, they have to be careful that they're not doing what his name just debated me, but it doesn't matter. What he used to do in his show, and he'd be asking questions, and they'd feel like, oh, I'm getting away with this, and he comes back with that one little question, and all of a sudden the whole case turns. So you need to be they're not allowed to do that. And there's been a number of places where the ministry has had cases thrown out because they didn't follow some of these simple rules. So if they're going to charge the employers, because they're legal entities and not people, don't have the same charter rights. They have some, and they certainly have the right to be protected from unreasonable search and seizure. So, the inspectors, they can come in and they can seize equipment, and they can actually seize it in place. So they can get a court order, I believe in this case, and they'll come in and say, you can no longer use that piece of equipment. We're seizing it in place. I believe that still requires a court order for that. You have the right to trial within a reasonable time, and we've seen that in the news a number of times over the last 10 or so years, where some people have been let off because the courts took so long to hear the case that they said it's unreasonable for somebody to wait that long. And the fundamental principle in our legal system is the presumption of innocence. So that's pretty important. So, but again, employers, they don't have to read employers' rights, but any individual they think they're going to charge will have to be read their rights. And unfortunately, I've had to do that a few times in the past. Neither of the times that I read somebody their rights that they actually were charged, because after I got to the point where it looked like, oh, this is going the wrong way, then I was able to ask a question, determine that, okay, all right, it didn't go that way. One involved a stop work order. I issued a stop work order as a Minister of Labor inspector. I came in, the stop work order was gone. The little tag I put on there, and it looked like this particular supervisor removed it. And so once he came in and said, yes, I removed it, or I can't remember all those exact details, I read him his rights. And then I got into all the details. I think something like it fell off the wires. It doesn't really matter. It's just, it now allows the inspector to start asking more probing questions that you don't have to answer. If you don't answer, then there's a good chance you're going to get prosecuted. If you do answer, then maybe the inspector will be able to put away that, prosecution isn't necessary. So, but under inspection, as I said, they can interview anybody, and cooperation is expected for inspections, but not for investigations.
Dave, we have another question.
Yep.
So do you have a suggestion for introductory health and safety training for management in a courthouse/police station setting?
Well, I guess it starts with the awareness regulation, but I think people need to understand the programs in place. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the courthouse situation. I mean, there's more than in like every workplace has to have violence and harassment training, but it's even more the case there. I mean, you just need to sit down. And again, I don't know if I can fully answer the question and maybe in the detail you're looking for, but it starts with the compliance obligations registry. Like, how do you know you're training people on all the things need to be trained on under the legislation if you don't even know what legislation applies to you? So I think, fundamentally under health and safety and environmental stuff, outside of, part of it is looking at those legal obligations. It all starts to me with risk assessments. And it's with a proper risk assessment that you identify what the risks are in the workplace, how big the risks they are, and what things people need to be trained on. Like, I know, you go to the average grocery store and, sometimes they get with hostile people that there's violence and harassment. Sometimes they get robbed. So they have a certain level of training, but that's probably not near the same training that you might see in a courthouse situation. Does that answer the question? I know it's kind of convoluted. I can't give you all the details about it, but there's I can say if you dig through the internet, you may find some guidance there, but that is not going to replace understanding your legal obligations and doing a risk assessment and understanding what people need to know to protect themselves. Did we get you answered the question back on there? Or?
I think we're good. I haven't seen anything back, so.
Yeah, Matt, I just reading the part of the question here as well. So it talks about training for managing. So managers need to understand the rules as well. They don't need the same detailed training as everyone else, but they need to understand what their obligations are. And, they need to understand things like the criminal code and, what they're expected to do. Like managers, again, they just need to understand what they need to do their part in the whole health and safety, environmental protection milieu, as the word goes. So, okay. So generally, as I was talking about inspections, so these are some legal quotes. As a general rule, an inquiry that focuses on obtaining evidence for possible prosecution, particularly in those being questioned, or not advised to legal counsel, would not be reasonable. Again, this is just saying that when prosecution is possible, you need to be read your rights. And the Court of Appeal held, this is in Ontario, I believe, the inspector powers could not be used after the Ministry of Environment and Climate, Conservation and Parks had reasonable grounds to believe that offense had been committed. Because once they believe that an offense has been committed, then they have to be thinking about prosecution, and now they have to read people as their rights. So there's been some pretty important stuff going on, and sitting down and talking to some of these lawyers and what inspectors can and can't do, maybe a little bit enlightening. But again, I think fundamentally you want to try and cooperate with the ministry inspectors when they come in, to the point reasonable, and I think that's a very important thing to look at. How far am I going to take it? I mean, I know I've had lawyers tell me things like, well, if you give them everything they ask for, and they haven't read you your rights, and they say where's this, and then they go back and try and charge you, there's a good chance that all that stuff they collected is going to be inadmissible. It just kind of sounds like it's a strategy. I don't know if it's a good strategy or a bad strategy, but you need to be careful with it. But it's just something to think about. They ask for information. Here you go. And the more stuff you give them under an inspection, the less likely they may be able to use it under an investigation and a prosecution. I don't know. Again, these are lawyers come in, and this is, lawyers certainly have opinions, and that's what some of them have said to me. I think it's you may be putting yourself in dire straits depending on the situation, but some of the legal stuff. So usually they're going to issue a report. They're going to review the observations they made. This is the time to ask for clarification. They're going to set dates for compliance very often. And this is where you need to have a meaningful conversation with the inspector, because if you don't, they're just going to set a bunch of dates because, you know, they're going to come in, and if they have this closing meeting, then they're going to go to a coffee shop or their car or something, and they're going to write the report, and they're going to come back, and there's going to be a bunch of compliance dates in it. And you need to try and make it as reasonable, and you just need to explain to them why, how long you would need for this. And, you know, they may not necessarily buy everything, but try and set as reasonable dates as you possibly can, depending on the risk level. But this is conversations you need to have with them. And you need to ask them, you know, is there really big things going on here? Like, is there something that like is a wow, or, you know, are you thinking about prosecution, or, you know, have these honest conversations with them to make sure that you understand what the priorities are. Because say you get your report and, you know, there's 10 orders and you get 8 of them complied with, and they come in to follow up and they find out that the 2 biggies are the ones you didn't comply with. You know, you probably want to know that, you know, you want to get the big hitters done, and there was a few little things, then, you know, this is, you know, they may be saying, okay, you know, you didn't post a copy of the act like I asked you to, but, you know, can you please get to it? And the ministry inspectors, I can tell you my experience is prosecutions are very time consuming, and the ministry does not take that lightly, and including the inspectors. So, you know, you need to recognize that they don't really want to prosecute you. Most inspectors, all the ones I knew and still know, they just want to do their job. They want you to comply with the legislation. They want you to do all these wonderful things. And prosecution is the last thing they want to do, because it takes them away from doing the things they really want to do. So, you know, you play ball with them. You show mutual respect. Some compliance dates get missed, but you have good reasons for it. There's a lot of things that can go there. Under enforcement, they can issue tickets under the Provincial Offences Act. They can't issue tickets for everything. There's a list of things they can issue tickets for. There's these things, I believe they still have these are Part 4 summons that they can actually issue on the spot, and it has maximum fines of 24 years ago, it was like $500, but there's a whole bunch of remedies that they have available to them under the Provincial Offences Act. They can issue orders. They can issue stop work orders. These are things that are often abused. Like, really, if the stop work order should be issued, they should be issuing it when they're there. Very often, stop work orders will be issued as a means of compelling compliance. So they'll go in and issue a time-based order, and they come back and you haven't done anything about it, and they put a stop work on it. Fundamentally, the stop work order is for things that are immediate hazards and really should be issued right away, but you know, you're probably not gonna win that argument. So they can be used to manipulate people to comply. And I apologize, but I did that 1 or 2 times. I remember this one company that they were an automotive spray booth. They're required to have, because what they're spraying, isocyanates, are required to have an airline respirator. I issued an order, and then I got a lot of song and dance from the owner of the company about how expensive it was and how long it was going to take to do. And, you know, we went way too long for it to happen. I finally went and issued a stop work order. I got a compliance. He complied with the order that day. Unfortunately, that's why inspectors do these things, because this is a tool to get stuff done that they think is important. And sometimes you're trying to give employers some latitude. You know, I'll give you some latitude. I won't close your workplace down. Because you think about this, you know, there's a number of things when we do audits that we think, you may not think are a high priority or a high hazard. But I look at things like guarding, which is basically should be almost zero tolerance. And I'll ask our client, what if the minister came in and shut that piece of equipment down? Well, we would shut down, because that's a key piece of equipment. Well, then you better guard it, because it's unguarded. And you can't wait for the minister to come in and issue a stop work order, because that little guarding issue could close your workplace for a period of time. If there's things that you can, this is the way I was trained with the ministry. So, you go out with seasoned inspectors when you first start. And very often one of the strategies, or used to be, is they'll just let me write up everything. So, there's a compressed gas cylinder is not secured. There's a fire extinguisher at that time that was under the industrial regs that wasn't inspected. And you issue all these orders, and you got this big long list of 10, 20 things, orders to issue. And then you're following up on them. You're calling, you're going back to the workplace. And then that seasoned inspector come over and explain, so aren't you sorry you did that? Because, if you can fix something right away, like there's a chain missing because the compressed gas cylinder is not secured and it's just because somebody didn't put the chain on, fix it right away. The inspector may not even write that up because it may not seem like a big deal, but you don't want this on your record. And, one of the reasons that one of my previous employers was charged and fined that $50,000 for that flare stack is because way back in the 60s, they had the same thing happen. They didn't have a compliance approval for a piece of equipment. And they looked at it and said, well, now you have repeat violation. This company's done this before. Yeah, but it was 50 years ago. It was crazy, but those are the kind, you just don't want these things in the report unless it's really necessary. So whatever you can do to get them to not write orders up is probably better. So, as I said, after the visit, if you get visited by enforcement officers, it might not be the best thing. The Ministry of Labor, Trades and Skills Development. I said I'd just call them Ministry of Labor, but I just took that opportunity to explain that acronym. May bring in specialists, so the engineers, occupational hygienists, ergonomists, they can do all this stuff, or they may require further data collection. Pinchin is one of the three companies that does air sampling and noise monitoring for the Ministry of Labor in Ontario. And so they may actually require, and so a lot of people talk about getting an order from the ministry, but the ministry can issue orders and they can issue requirements. And so under those sections of the Act, there's a bunch of things, because they can't issue an order unless there's a violation. Requirements are for things where they suspect there's a violation, but they're not sure. That's what a requirement is. So they may require you to say, we're not sure whether there's problems with the air in this workplace, so we're going to make you do air monitoring. And if they choose, they can either tell you to do it. If they actually go out and do it themselves, then you may need to be concerned, because it's usually only then that they're actually considering things like prosecution, because now they're collecting their own independent information and not relying on one of your consultants or your internal people to do that air monitoring. So again, that's just a clue that if they require an outside consultant to come and do air monitoring, their prosecution may be being considered, or they just chose to do it that day. Maybe they're some ways doing you a favor because they're going to pay for this and you don't have to pay for it, but they may require you to do this testing anyways. And it could be air monitoring, could be an engineering study. There's a bunch of things they can do under that. So again, as I mentioned, if there's compliance delays, contact the officer as soon as possible and discuss, saying, I know the date's today, but we just weren't able to do it. And if you have your Joint Health and Safety Committee on side with you, it's just going to be that much easier. You can appeal most actions of the government. So you can appeal requirements, you can appeal orders. Essentially, I believe what the Act says still is you can appeal any decision of an inspector, recognizing even the Assistant Deputy Minister of Labor is probably an inspector, possibly. I don't know if they still do that under the Act. And if that person makes a decision you don't like, you can appeal it. So anything they essentially say or do, you can appeal. A lot of employers don't want to appeal because they don't want to take it that level. And unfortunately, the way the appeals work, you still have to comply with the law until the appeal is heard. And these things generally take like a year and a half sometimes to happen. But they're very often, these are cases where, we've tried to convince some clients to appeal because in our opinion, there wasn't a violation, but they don't want to rock the boat with the ministry. That's up to them, but you certainly have the right to appeal if you think something is being wrong. And sometimes you may have the backing of an association you belong to, because this is going to affect everyone in the association potentially. But so it's just a tool to use. So you have, I believe, about 30 days under the Ministry of Labor Act to appeal, and for the Ministry of Environment, it's 15 days for most of these things. And I also believe, I don't think it's changed. I did have a quick look around. Ministry of Environment officers' orders actually only come from directors. So you may get some directives or something from an officer, but they usually have to go back and talk to directors. It doesn't really matter. You still get the order. It doesn't matter who issued it. So, and as I said, there's no hearing is required. So you can't say, I can't believe they're doing this. I mean, if there is any hearing available, it's not to me, it's not out of the purview to say, can I speak to your manager? My experience with the Ministry of Labor, and maybe it's changed in 24 years, is an inspector does something and the manager is there supporting them, and you're going to get a circling of the wagons, and there's not a good chance that the manager is going to overturn what the inspector did, but they might. Like, if you think it's that bad, and there has been some bad ones. I've seen some of the things that some inspectors have done. I just shake my head because I know that's not the way it's supposed to be done. But so you do have some options, or you just comply with the orders. Oh, I changed this slide. Like I used to say, how can Pinchin help you? These are all certainly things that ways Pinchin can help you, but any good consultancy can. We're not going to hold your feet to the fire, and you have to use Pinchin, as great as we are. But we do, our group, the group that I'm in, Occupational Health and Safety, it's kind of a misnomer because we also do a lot of environmental work as well, particularly environmental compliance audits. But we do a lot of audits, and most of them, a good majority of them, are for companies that have ISO 14001 or 45001 certifications, because they're required to do compliance audits generally once every 3 years. So we'll see those. And we do them for a lot of other companies that just want that extra set of eyes to look at their operations. One of the values, obviously, consultants bring is, in my career, I can tell you I've been to, I guess that at least well over 3,000 workplaces between the Ministry of Labor, as I remember when I left there, and I had done 1,800 field visits when I was with the Ministry of Labor in 10 years. I don't think that's a record, but it may be, who knows. And then all the work I did with my previous employer, because we had on-site services, so I got a chance to go to see just about all the big chemical producers in Canada and their locations, how they do things. And of course, with Pinchin, I don't know how many audits I've done, every year. So what we do, what we can bring to the table that you can internally is, well, I've seen this other company and this is the way they deal with that issue, and share that knowledge with you and that experience. And knowing the legislation, my job as an auditor is to know the legislation. Your job as a manager of environmental health and safety is to manage your program and as best you can know the legislation. So it's very often just bringing that extra set of eyes, that little different level of expertise. The fact that we've dealt with regulators over the years and we ask them questions about compliance and different things. So there's certainly values in having consultants help you out with that stuff. And as I mentioned, risk assessments, hazardous materials assessments, contractor management, confined spaces. These are some of the biggies where you may need some help. Risk assessments can be sometimes quite detailed, and when we write these kind of procedures, we'll have risk assessments that are simple ones that anyone trained in the workplace can do, but there may be triggers as you go along saying, we can't do this ourselves. we need to have Ryan Mallard or Brian Agnew come in with one of their techs and do some air monitoring, because that's not something we're willing to learn how to do or can't be bothered to do, because we only really need it this one time, or once a year or something. We have a air monitoring campaign going on, so consultants can certainly help with all that stuff. And don't underestimate contractor management. This is really becoming much more important to a lot of companies, because whatever your contractor does, they're essentially your employees on that day. So please understand that. And of course, customized training. So I think, unfortunately, I've talked way too long, but let me just leave these closing thoughts with you. Ask yourself, are you protecting your assets? Are you protecting your reputation? Are your stakeholders happy? Are you in compliance with at least the minimum expectations of the legislation or your industry? Are you protecting your employees and the environment? This is fundamental to a lot of managers' ideologies. Ensuring your employers are doing what you think they are doing. Ensuring that your contractors are doing what you think they're doing, and really getting full value from your auditing efforts and your monitoring. So that's where I'll leave it. I'm more than happy to stay along for any questions or anything else that you'd like to ask, or certainly after the fact, we can be contacted, and I'm more than happy to follow up. I believe there was a question, I think it was answered, that all these presentations are made available on our website. So I appreciate your attendance, and I hope you found it interesting.